The ancient world was not only built on empires of stone, but also on the courage of those who looked beyond the horizon. Among them stands Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian mariner whose name drifts between the margins of history and myth. In the 5th century before Christ, when most sailors hesitated to stray too far from the sight of land, Hanno commanded a fleet and sailed beyond the familiar cradle of the Mediterranean into the vast and restless Atlantic. Few in his time could have imagined such a feat. Fewer still would dare to follow. What makes his tale remarkable is not only the journey itself, but the survival of his own words. From the shadows of antiquity, a rare logbook whispers his account. Ancient voyages often dissolved into legend, carried only by rumor or reshaped by poets, but here was the hand of the traveler himself, recording what he saw, what he feared, and what he hoped. That parchment, translated and preserved in fragments, offers us one of the earliest windows into the Carthaginian world, and its vision of the sea as both opportunity and abyss. Carthage was no stranger to the ocean's embrace. Rising as a formidable maritime power along the North African coast, its people inherited the seafaring genius of the Phoenicians. Yet Hanno's expedition was different. So, this was no mere venture for trade or war. It was an odyssey toward the unknown, commissioned to explore the limits of the habitable world. His fleet, described as carrying thousands of settlers, priests, and provisions, bore not only the weight of ambition, but the whisper of destiny. He was to chart lands no Carthaginian eyes had seen, to plant new colonies, and to stretch the invisible threads of empire beyond the pillars of Heracles. As his ships slipped past that narrow strait we call Gibraltar, the known world fell away. The Mediterranean, that enclosed sea of bustling harbors and ancient rivalries, gave way to an expanse that seemed infinite. To the ancients, the Atlantic was more than an ocean. It was a cosmic boundary, a liquid darkness where gods might hide islands or cast storms with the flick of their hand. To cross it was not merely daring. It was to step into the theater of the unknown, where myth and geography blurred. In his log, Hanno described coasts rich with forests, rivers teeming with life, and skies heavy with the cries of unfamiliar birds. He recounted encounters with people whose faces and customs defied the Carthaginian imagination, and landscapes both lush and terrifying. Among the most haunting of his notes lies what may be humanity's first written account of gorillas. He wrote of wild, hairy beings, fierce and unyielding, that resisted capture and fought with such ferocity that his men could only subdue them through violence. The skins of these strange creatures, he claimed, were carried back as trophies. To later scholars, this chilling passage became a riddle of zoology and myth. Were these truly gorillas, or some distorted echo of a darker legend? And so, Hanno emerges from history not merely as a navigator, but as a figure suspended between truth and mystery. His words allow us to glimpse what the ancients feared and desired when gazing westward: new lands, strange peoples, creatures beyond imagination, and the constant hum of the unknown. His voyage lingers as a reminder that humanity has always been torn between the safety of the familiar and the hunger for discovery. Yet even as we read his account, questions stir. Where exactly did his ships land? How far did he sail down the African coast? What secrets did he conceal? And what knowledge may have been deliberately erased by time or rival civilizations? The navigator's call was not simply the beginning of a journey. It was the opening of a riddle that still resists answers, beckoning us deeper into the vast sea of unsolved mysteries. To understand Hanno's journey, one must first look upon the city that sent him forth. Carthage, perched on the North African coast, had once been no more than a distant outpost of the Phoenicians, a colony born of Tyre's ambition. Yet by the 5th century before Christ, it had grown into a mighty power in its own right, a rival not only in commerce but in dreams. Where Tyre had been the mother, Carthage had become the heir. An heir with teeth sharper than its predecessors and an appetite to master the sea. The Carthaginians inherited the Phoenician genius for navigation, that instinct for stars, currents, and winds that allowed them to treat the ocean as a road rather than a barrier. But their ambitions stretched further, for Carthage was not content with survival. It sought supremacy. Gold was its pulse, commerce its heartbeat. To secure wealth was to secure power, and whispers of gold from the rivers of far-off Africa lured them as surely as myths of El Dorado would captivate explorers millennia later. By controlling those sources directly, Carthage could free itself from the tangled web of middlemen, cutting away the hands of rivals and drawing the riches of Africa straight into its harbors. Thus, the great expedition of Hanno was not born only of curiosity or courage, but also of necessity and strategy. Population within the city had swelled, pressing against the walls and resources. Ignoring. Colonies were a solution, places to resettle the restless, to spread the reach of Carthaginian culture, and to weave a chain of footholds along the African coast. His fleet was said to number 60 ships, an armada vast enough to echo like thunder as it departed the harbor. Ancient records claim it bore as many as 30,000 souls, a number so immense it borders on legend. Scholars now suspect the figure was closer to 5,000. A still formidable host, carrying settlers, priests, livestock, tools, and dreams of new beginnings. Whether 30,000 or 5, the scale alone reveals the gravity of the mission. Logistics would have haunted every decision. To feed so many mouths, to keep ships together across uncharted waters, to establish settlements on unknown shores. All this demanded foresight and resilience. Each wave that struck their hulls tested not just wood and rope, but the endurance of human resolve. And yet, this immense risk was weighed against the promise of riches and dominion. To the Carthaginians, such risk was not folly, but destiny. The dual purpose of Hanno's voyage mirrored the dual nature of Carthage itself, mercantile and imperial, pragmatic and ambitious. On one hand, they sought profit, tracing routes that would funnel ivory, gold, and exotic beasts back to their markets. On the other, they pursued settlement, a chance to scatter their people like seeds, ensuring that Carthage would not be contained by walls of stone, but would grow like a vine along foreign coasts. In this, they resembled their Phoenician ancestors, who had planted colonies across the Mediterranean, but now the Carthaginians looked westward, to realms the Phoenicians had only whispered about. Behind the grand vision, however, lingered tension. Every supply ship risked failure. Every colony planted in strange soil could wither. Every encounter with unknown peoples carried the shadow of alliance or bloodshed. The expedition was a gamble on the scale of empire, where the stakes were survival and glory intertwined. And so, when Hanno's ships disappeared beyond the pillars of Heracles, they carried not only settlers and soldiers, but the vast ambition of Carthage itself. A hunger that could not be sated by the Mediterranean's familiar waters. What awaited them beyond was uncertain, but the desire that drove them was undeniable, to bind the edge of the known world to Carthage's throne. The sea narrows where the mountains of Iberia lean toward the African coast, and there the ancients saw the threshold of the world. To pass through the pillars of Hercules was to step beyond the order of the known, into a realm once believed to belong only to gods and monsters. It was here that Hanno's fleet, sails straining and oars cutting the tide, left behind the Mediterranean's familiar harbors and crossed into the vastness of the Atlantic. The Carthaginians, heirs to Phoenician daring, had often whispered of what lay beyond, but few had braved the crossing. In the roar of that strait, with the wind funneling like a divine breath, they entered a sea without boundaries, its horizon a haunting invitation to both wonder and dread. On the western shore, in the lands we now call Morocco, Hanno's company laid the seeds of their first colonies. The texts speak of a place called Thyotarion, among others, settlements carved into a coast of rugged beauty. There they planted the banners of Carthage, raised altars, and built stations that would bind this new world to their homeland. Yet the record is curiously imprecise. Hanno does not gift us with clear coordinates or maps. Instead, his words are veiled, vague, as if deliberately wrapped in shadow. Some modern scholars believe this haziness was no accident. To openly declare the locations would have invited enemies. Greek rivals, Iberian opportunists, even suspicious allies. To seize what Carthage had struggled to establish. In obscurity, there was protection. The paradox is striking. It is precisely this vagueness, the refusal to describe with precision, that lends the account a strange credibility. A false tale would likely have boasted details, embellishments woven to impress. But Hanno's log carries the spareness of a mariner's record, its silence more convincing than a chorus of exaggerated claims. Like the guarded tone of a merchant protecting trade secrets, his words suggest knowledge too valuable to be squandered in ink. Thus the text reads half like a confession, half like a riddle, leaving us to imagine the untold landscapes where those early Carthaginian settlers stepped ashore. For the men and women aboard those ships, the founding of colonies was not merely a political command, but a deeply spiritual act. To build upon foreign soil was to confront both the land spirit and its dangers. Ritual fires would have been lit, sacrifices offered to Baal Hammon and Tanit, asking the gods to accept the newcomers and protect their walls. In their minds, every coastline held unseen forces. Friendly or hostile, whose favor had to be won. Thus, the story of Thyotarion is not only a matter of trade routes and strategy, but also of myth and faith, a dialogue between Carthaginian ambition and the untamed soul of the Atlantic shore. From this precarious foothold, the horizon beckoned ever further. The settlers remained, but the fleet pressed onward, for Hanno's task was not finished. Each harbor carved into the African coast was both an anchor and a doorway, holding the promise of survival while urging the navigators deeper into mystery. Behind them lay the Mediterranean, where the world seemed orderly and mapped. Ahead stretched coasts unnamed, rivers uncharted, and dangers unimagined. As the sound of the waves swallowed their sails, one truth became clear. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, certainty itself dissolved, and the voyage was no longer only an expedition, but a descent into the very marrow of the unknown. Beyond their first colonies, the Carthaginian fleet pressed further southward, hugging a coast that seemed to stretch endlessly, its contours shifting with every tide. There, where the land met the restless Atlantic, Hanno's company encountered a people who would prove vital to their survival. The Lixits. These herders dwelled along the banks of a river they called Lixos, which some believe corresponds to the modern Draa, a waterway that carries life through Morocco's arid reaches before surrendering itself to the sea. The meeting was not marked by the clash of weapons, but by gestures of welcome. To the Carthaginians, weary from weeks of travel, the sight of cattle grazing along fertile banks must have seemed like a vision of stability in a landscape that whispered of uncertainty. The Lixites, skilled with their herds and familiar with the land's rhythms, extended friendship to the strangers who had descended upon their shores in towering vessels. Perhaps they saw in these newcomers an opportunity, a bridge to faraway trade. Perhaps they simply recognized the universal plight of travelers in need. Diplomacy was as crucial as seamanship on such voyages, and here Hanno proved himself more than a navigator. He was a broker of trust. The log suggests that the Carthaginians and Lixites reached an understanding, one that allowed the fleet to rest, to resupply, and, most importantly, to gain interpreters. For the river marked not only a boundary of geography, but a threshold of culture. Beyond this point stretched lands whose tongues, customs, and mysteries were utterly alien to Carthaginian ears. Without guidance, the expedition risked stumbling blind into hostility. With interpreters, they carried voices that could bridge worlds. To the ancients, interpreters were more than translators. They were guardians of meaning, negotiators of truth, often walking a fine line between ally and outsider. The presence of Lixite guides meant that Hanno's fleet could step beyond familiar boundaries with a measure of confidence. Yet it also meant entrusting their fate to men whose loyalties belonged to another people, another soil. In this fragile balance lay both opportunity and danger. The river itself, winding and fertile, must have felt like a benevolent omen. Water had always been sacred to Carthage, for it was from the sea that their wealth flowed, and from rivers that agriculture was born. To drink from the Lixos was, in a sense, to drink from the unknown world itself. Here, Carthage's ambition touched the edge of Africa's deeper heart, and the bond with the Lixots became a thread weaving the known into the unknown. There is something profoundly symbolic in this encounter. Civilization often advances not through conquest, but through moments of recognition, when strangers share bread, language, and purpose. In forging an alliance with the Lixots, Hanno's expedition did more than secure interpreters. They secured a passage of trust into realms uncharted. The Carthaginians, who carried their gods and their banners, now also carried voices that could unlock doors to landscapes they had only dreamed of. And yet, one cannot help but feel the tremor of what lay ahead. The Lixos was the last river that still bore some whisper of familiarity, the last land where the Carthaginians could pause among friends before pushing onward into territories that no kinship had softened. Beyond this point, every encounter would be weighted with uncertainty, every shoreline a question. The alliance with the Lixots was both comfort and farewell. A reminder that even the bravest of journeys begins with hands extended in peace before the true shadows of the unknown rise to meet the traveler. From the banks of the Lixos, where trust had been secured and interpreters gained, the Carthaginian fleet pressed further into waters where every sunrise seemed to unveil a new horizon. They sailed along coastlines untamed by familiar maps, each promontory looming like a guardian of secrets. It was in this place of liminality, where the known dissolved into the unknown, that they founded Cern. The last settlement before the sea swallowed certainty. The log places Cern at a distance measured in days of sailing from Carthage's earlier colonies, yet its precise location remains an enigma. Some scholars whisper of the Bay of Arguin in modern Mauritania, a sheltered inlet rich with fisheries and strategic for trade. Others lean toward the bleak expanses of the Western Sahara, where the desert runs to the sea and the horizon offers little comfort. The ambiguity itself has become part of the mystery, as though Hanno's account deliberately obscured Cern's coordinates, leaving us only with shadows of geography and fragments of memory. Yet what is certain is its symbolic weight. Cern was not simply a colony, it was a threshold. To the Carthaginians, it marked the farthest reach of their ancestral heritage, the last anchor before venturing into a realm where no Phoenician or Greek had left a record. From its foundations rose the tension of finality. Here the fleet planted a foot in soil they could call their own, and from here they would push into coasts that no chart, no rumor, had yet tamed. Cern must have pulsed with a dual identity. On the one hand, it functioned as a trading post, a place where exotic goods could be gathered and where settlers might secure food and shelter. On the other, it embodied the Carthaginian psyche, a people who looked at borders not as walls, but as invitations. Never. To those who lived there, Cern was both home and horizon. Its hearths swarming families, its docks releasing ships into the wilderness of waves. One imagines the rituals that must have accompanied its founding. Carthaginian priests raising fires to Balhaman, libations poured to Tanit, invocations murmured to ensure this far-flung fragment of empire would thrive. To sanctify ground so distant from their homeland was to demand the gods stretch their protection across immeasurable seas. The stones laid at Cerne, whether crude or enduring, were more than walls. They were prayers embedded in earth. But beyond ritual and commerce, Cern was psychological armor. To sailors who looked southward into the unknown, it offered a tether of reassurance. Should storms break their hulls or strange coasts turn hostile, Cerne was the last door they could retreat through, the last reminder that they still belonged to a world that made sense. Past its limits, there would be no guarantees, no easy retreat. Beyond Cerne lay only mystery. And here, the tension grows, for every outpost founded thus far was tied, however tenuously, to whispers known from traders, or to lands once sighted by Phoenician cousins. But south of Cern stretched a blankness, a realm untamed even by rumor. To venture past it was to sever ties with tradition and to enter a geography that existed only in imagination. The Carthaginians may have looked out from its shores and seen the sea as both promise and abyss, knowing that from this point forward, every discovery would carry the weight of firstness, and every error could mean oblivion. Cern, then, was more than the last outpost. It was the edge of a map where ink falters, where the known world exhales and the unknown begins to breathe. The fleet lingered here, gathering strength, whispering prayers, and preparing to step into a vastness no ancestor had charted. The stage was set, and the sea beyond waited like an ancient riddle. The river widened, its waters no longer the calm lifeline of the north, but a vast, restless expanse that carried with it the breath of an entirely new world. For the first time, the expedition felt they had crossed a threshold. Stepping beyond the borders of what their ancestors had charted, into lands whispered about in the markets of Carthage and Alexandria, but never truly known. The heat was thicker, the air heavier, laced with the scent of unseen vegetation and the cries of unfamiliar birds. Here, the desert silence gave way to a living chorus, wild and unrestrained, echoing through the river valleys like a language not meant for men. They saw creatures that seemed conjured from the imagination of storytellers. Along the banks, immense forms stirred in the reeds, beasts with hides like polished stone, eyes that glimmered just above the water, and jaws capable of crushing bone with ease. Hippopotami, the old text had spoken, but only as ancient phantoms once known in Egypt. Extinct there for generations, surviving only in temple carvings and half-forgotten chants. Yet here they rose, living, colossal, their groans reverberating across the night. The men whispered prayers, unsure whether to view them as animals or as river gods guarding the unknown. Not far behind, the crocodiles drifted like drifting shadows, almost indistinguishable from the current until their armored backs broke the surface. To the Mediterranean eye, accustomed to lions of Libya and elephants of Carthage, these creatures were altogether alien, an army of scaled demons cloaked in water. Tales told back home of dragons seemed suddenly less absurd. Every ripple on the river became suspect, every splash a reminder that the land itself harbored guardians who had never seen foreign sails. The river they followed, believed by some to be the Senegal, remained itself a mystery. Did it flow into the ocean they knew, or into some inner heart of the continent that no Greek, Phoenician, or Roman had ever reached? Its waters glistened with secrets, and many believed its depths hid not only beasts but also wealth. Traders in distant ports spoke of gold washed down from the lands of the interior, carried in grains by these very waters. The men, though weary, could not resist wondering if they had stumbled upon the hidden source of wealth that had long enriched the kingdoms farther north. Was this the stream where ancient kings dipped their nets for fortune, or was that merely another illusion cast by distance and desire? The deeper they pressed, the more alien the world became. Forests rose dense and green, breathing out a humid mist that seemed to smother their torches. Night fell like a velvet curtain, pierced only by strange cries. Laughter that was not laughter, screeches that seemed half human, half spirit. The sailors tightened their circle around the fires, feeling themselves intruders in a land where their maps and gods held no power. Here, no star-guided compass could assure them of safety, and yet, beneath the fear, there was wonder. To set foot where no step from their homeland had ever been, to witness animals that existed only in carved reliefs or half-remembered songs, was to feel the raw pulse of discovery. They were not merely voyagers, but the first to bridge two worlds. Mediterranean and tropical, known and unknown. Each turn of the river carried them deeper into mystery, as if the earth itself were unfolding a hidden chapter, one that no scroll or library had ever recorded. What awaited them beyond the next bend, none could say. But the river called them onward, deeper into the breathing heart of a continent that would not easily yield its secrets. 12 days they sailed, and each dawn seemed to loosen the ties that bound them to the world they had known. The sea itself felt altered, as though its rhythm no longer belonged to the familiar oceans of merchants and kings, but to a realm uncharted, breathing with its own strange pulse. The helmsman spoke little, their eyes fixed on a horizon that refused to change, and even the waves carried a silence that pressed heavily on the crew's hearts. Beyond the 12th sunrise, they were certain they had passed the very borders of memory, slipping into a domain where no map could guide them and no tale could prepare them. It was the boldest leap they had ever taken. A voyage into a void, not of emptiness, but of overwhelming mystery. On the farthest edge of this passage, they encountered shores where people emerged like shadows from the forest, clothed in woven fibers dyed with hues the voyagers could scarcely describe. These people spoke in tongues so alien that even the most gifted interpreters among the crew, men who could unravel a dozen dialects with ease, found themselves utterly defeated. The words struck their ears like the call of birds or the rush of rivers. No, sounds filled with life, yet carrying no meaning they could grasp. It was as if human speech itself had shifted into another form, a reminder that language is not only a tool of commerce or command, but a vessel of thought, a reflection of worlds shaped by centuries of silence and song. Despite the chasm of incomprehension, exchanges began. Fragments of understanding were brokered not through words but through gesture, the universal currency of hands pointing, eyes glancing, objects offered and received. From these silent negotiations emerged wonders, woods fragrant enough to perfume entire chambers, resins that burned with smoke sweeter than honey, powders and dyes of startling brilliance, richer than anything seen in the markets of known kingdoms. Yet with every treasure came an unease. The sense that these gifts were not simply commodities, but tokens from cultures whose secrets were not meant for outsiders. The crew kept careful record of these discoveries, but their notes were shrouded in secrecy, encoded so that only their own circle might one day decipher them. For knowledge was as valuable as gold, and in such distant seas, knowledge was perilous. One misplaced word, one revelation shared too openly, could summon rivals or awaken dangers they were not prepared to face. Thus the expedition learned to guard silence as fiercely as they pursued discovery, as if the very survival of their voyage depended on concealing what they had seen. The further they ventured, the more the men felt the weight of their isolation, the laughter of familiar taverns, the calls of known marketplaces, the cadences of recognizable tongues. All faded into memory. Even the stars above seemed subtly rearranged, constellations bending into unfamiliar patterns. Some whispered that they had sailed beyond the reach of the gods they once prayed to, and into a realm governed by other powers, older and indifferent. And others clung to faith that their endurance would carve a new place for them in the chronicles of men, a testament that the known world was but a fragment of something far vaster. Each night, the ocean sang differently, its voice deeper, as though echoing from caverns beneath the waves. Each morning, the faces on the shore grew stranger, the gestures harder to interpret. And yet, the voyagers pressed on, compelled by a hunger that no fear could quench. The desire to glimpse what lay beyond the veil of the familiar, to stretch the boundaries of human daring into places where silence, secrecy, and wonder ruled. The 12th day closed, but the void did not end. It only widened, drawing them further into its embrace. What waited beyond, none dared to name. The night descended with a stillness so heavy it seemed to press against the very skin of those who dared to sleep upon that alien shore. For hours the sea had whispered softly, as though nothing unusual stirred beyond the reach of the waves. Yet when the last embers of twilight bled into darkness, the horizon awoke with an unearthly glow. Fires, countless, innumerable fires, began to flicker along the mainland's edge. They were not campfires in the ordinary sense, not the humble sparks of fishermen or shepherds, but an ocean of flame-born eyes staring back across the water. Each one rose and fell in rhythm, as if governed by some hidden order, some ritual choreography older than memory. The men stood transfixed, their voices caught in their throats. These fires seemed to breathe, pulsing like the veins of a great unseen heart. And with them came sound. At first it was faint, a distant throb carried on the salt wind. Low, insistent drums beating as though in echo of the earth's own pulse. Soon the rhythm was joined by flutes, shrill and winding, a serpentine melody weaving through the night. Then chanting. Many voices, layered and rising, their words impossible to grasp yet heavy with meaning. It was neither celebration nor mourning, but something far more primal, a summoning that reached across the waves to grip the bones of those who heard it. Cuddy, the crew huddled close, whispering half-formed prayers. Some swore they saw figures moving in the firelight. Shadows dancing, arms raised to heavens unseen. Others claimed the flames themselves shifted into shapes, twisting into beasts and faces that leered with silent menace. Fear, once creeping, now spread like wildfire through the company. Even the most hardened sailors, men who had faced tempests and lived through wars, felt their resolve falter before this spectral chorus. Sleep was a stranger that night. Each attempt at rest was shattered by sudden bursts of drumming that seemed closer than before, or by the mournful cry of a flute that pierced the night like a blade. Now and then, from the inland dark, a sound would rise unlike any instrument. A guttural cry, too human to be beast and too distorted to be human. Some thought it laughter, others agony, but all agreed it was a sound not meant for mortal ears. The captain, once steadfast, now paced with unease. He knew the sea could shelter men from many things, but not from fear that gnaws the mind. With dawn still far, he gathered his officers in hushed council. They spoke of omens, of the possibility that they were intruders upon sacred ground, of the strange pattern of encounters that had grown stranger with each passing league. One conclusion alone held weight: they could not remain. When the first pale blush of morning stretched across the horizon, relief washed over them like cool rain. The fires had vanished as though they had never been, leaving behind no ash, no smoke, only silence. Yet that silence was more dreadful than the clamor of the night, for it carried the weight of things unspoken, a warning unheeded. Without hesitation, the crew made ready their vessel, pulling anchor with trembling hands. None dared to look back at the shoreline that had blazed with mysteries only hours before. As the ship turned toward open waters, the men felt both gratitude and dread. Gratitude for escape, dread for the knowledge that they had glimpsed something vast, unknowable, perhaps waiting beyond the next horizon. What they had seen was not simply ritual nor revelry, but a glimpse into a realm where fire and sound were messengers of forces unseen. And though they fled, the echo of that night, its drums, its flutes, its countless flames, would follow them still, like shadows that cling long after the light has gone. The sea lay heavy and dark beneath the prow of the expedition's vessel, when suddenly the horizon itself seemed to writhe. At first, the crew thought it was some trick of sunset, a feverish glow upon the waves. But as the night deepened, the illusion did not fade. It grew. Before their astonished eyes, the coast appeared to be aflame, as though some vast furnace had been kindled at the edge of the earth. The heat in the air was suffocating, rolling toward them in waves, and the night sky above was pierced by tongues of fire rising from the land. They were not merely witnesses to a spectacle of nature. They were intruders in a realm where the gods themselves seemed to forge their weapons. The mountain towered, vast and unyielding, its slopes painted by rivers of molten light. Sparks burst into the heavens like fiery omens, while plumes of smoke curled into shapes both terrifying and divine. The men stood silent, their oars forgotten, as though paralyzed before an altar. Here, the earth itself breathed fire, and the expedition could only bow in awe. To them, there could be no rational explanation for such fury. This was no mere mountain. It was a chariot of the gods, drawn across the heavens with wheels of flame, its course charted not by human maps, but by divine will. Yet within the terror there was also strange beauty. The burning glow illuminated the coastline, showing jagged rocks like teeth, blackened forests like ancient sacrifices. Some whispered prayers, others curses, but all felt their own smallness before the raging colossus. In their songs and stories, they would later call this place the dwelling of divine fire, the very forge of creation. How else could one explain a blaze so immense that the sea itself reflected its fury, as if the waters had caught fire from the breath of the mountain? For the modern scholar, the veil of myth is thinner. They look upon maps and find an answer in Mount Cameroon, the great volcanic sentinel of Africa, rising more than 13,000 feet into the clouds. To geologists, its fiery torrents are the result of subterranean forces, the restless shifting of tectonic plates, magma thrust skyward in defiance. And yet, even with such knowledge, one cannot escape the old awe. Science gives names to processes, but names do not tame them. When fire consumes the heavens, when thunderous booms shake the land, it is easy to understand why ancient travelers knelt in reverence, believing themselves to stand before the engines of divinity. This moment became not only the climax of their voyage, but also a gift for later ages. A point fixed upon the shifting sea of history, for through their testimony, we trace their route, aligning myth with geography. The chariot of the gods was no phantom, no imagined vision, but a living mountain, burning with the fury of the earth itself. And yet, perhaps myth saw more truly than science ever could. To call it a volcano is to reduce it to mechanics, but to name it a divine chariot is to acknowledge what all who saw it felt, the raw presence of power beyond human scale. As the expedition turned its gaze away from the blazing titan, they carried with them both dread and revelation. The fire at the world's edge marked not only their path, but also their destiny, a reminder that their journey was not merely across seas, but into the very heart of mystery itself. And still, farther shores awaited, where wonders more subtle and enigmas more profound would rise before them. The days of the voyage had already been heavy with strangeness. Fires flickering on the coastlines, islands thick with the stench of beasts, rivers that seemed to breathe mist like living things. Yet nothing prepared the travelers for what awaited them on that remote, forested shore. It was here, among the tangled thickets of trees and the cries of unseen creatures, that the sailors glimpsed shapes unlike anything known in the world of Carthage. They described them as wild, hairy beings. Figures that walked upright like men, but bore the strength and savagery of animals. The locals called them gorilli, a word that would echo through history with the weight of enigma. At first, the crew approached cautiously, as if unsure whether these were men cursed by the gods or some primal guardian of the land. The gorilli, however, did not flee at the sight of strangers. They stood their ground, shrieking, baring teeth, their massive arms swinging with menace. When the sailors attempted to capture them, the confrontation turned violent. The creatures fought ferociously, resisting with a force that astonished hardened men of the sea. They struck with fists and teeth, and though the sailors had nets and weapons, their prey would not be taken alive. Blood was shed, and only with great effort did the men subdue a few. Even then, they were left with corpses rather than captives, their skins stripped as grim trophies of survival. What followed would etch the tale deeper into legend. These hides were carried across the waters, guarded with reverence as proof of what had been seen. In Carthage, they were displayed in a temple, where generation after generation gazed upon them with wonder. To citizens of the great city, they were not just curiosities but sacred relics of exploration, physical evidence that the known world still concealed unfathomable mysteries. For centuries the skins endured, until Rome's fury consumed Carthage, and with it the last tangible link to that strange encounter. Yet the memory refused to die. Scholars of later ages debated what Hanno's men had truly witnessed. Were they gorillas, the great apes of Africa, unknown to the Mediterranean world? Or were they chimpanzees, smaller yet fierce, whose behavior matched the sailors' descriptions? The debate still stirs modern minds. Irina. Ancient words blur with time, and the exact size, movements, and cries of the gorilla remain uncertain. What is clear, however, is that these were not myths conjured from fear. They were living beings, encountered in the flesh, whose skins bore witness long after their forms had vanished. There is something haunting in this story, not merely because of its brutality, but because it reflects humanity's restless hunger to know what lies beyond the horizon. The Carthaginians did not only seek new trade routes or fertile lands, they sought to map the edges of existence itself, and in doing so, they collided with another branch of creation. Creatures so close to man in form, yet so distant in spirit that they unsettled every certainty. In the gorilla, perhaps, the sailors saw a distorted mirror, a reflection of mankind's own primal origins, stripped of cities and temples, roaring from the depths of an older world. When the last hide turned to dust, the mystery only deepened. We are left with questions rather than answers, a reminder that exploration is never just a matter of geography. It is also a journey into the unknown corners of ourselves. For what terrifies us in such encounters may not be the beasts alone, but the possibility that we recognize something of our own shadow in them. The voyage pressed onward, but the memory of the gorilla lingered, whispering of boundaries not yet crossed and truths not yet spoken. The return was never as simple as retracing a line upon the sea. The winds that had borne them outward now resisted with a stubborn breath, as if the very ocean wished to hold them prisoner. The sailors of Carthage, seasoned though they were, found themselves battling not only the heavy currents that dragged them backwards, but also the invisible forces of fatigue, longing, and doubt. Each sail strained against the heavens, each oar dipped into waters that seemed unwilling to release them. Yet, through cunning seamanship and sheer resolve, they turned resistance into rhythm, and the same waters that sought to deny their return became the stage upon which they proved their mastery. It was not merely a voyage back to familiar shores, but a crucible of endurance where man contended with the caprice of the elements. When at last the familiar harbors rose before their weary eyes, there was no simple triumph. For behind the relief of safe return lay a deeper awareness. They had crossed boundaries of knowledge, entered seas unmarked by familiar maps, and returned alive to tell of it. This was their legacy. Not only to Carthage, but to all who dream of tracing the edges of the known world. Each voyage that defied the prevailing winds, each harbor wrestled from storm, whispered of a civilization that possessed a vision greater than trade and conquest. Carthage, for all its ambitions, was also the keeper of horizons, willing to challenge the ocean's secrecy. Yet as the sailors found rest, another mystery arose, older than their sails and deeper than their charts. Far across the deserts of Mesopotamia lay the shadow of a city whispered by kings and chroniclers, Agade, the seat of Sargon, a capital so radiant that its name had been carved into the memory of empires. And yet, unlike Carthage with its proud harbors still echoing with the shouts of dock workers, Agade had vanished into dust, leaving behind no walls, no gates, no citadel that could testify to its glory. It is as if the earth itself had conspired to swallow it whole, erasing the capital of the first great empire as though it were a dream too luminous to endure. For centuries, scholars and seekers have pursued the phantom of a god, scouring tablets that speak of its wealth, rivers that might once have embraced its walls, and fragments of prayers that invoked its name. Some place it near the Tigris, others along the Euphrates, while a few imagine it lying beneath unbroken stretches of desert. Each theory adds a new layer of intrigue, yet the city itself remains elusive, a puzzle whose missing pieces seem scattered beyond reach. Just as the Carthaginian mariners had fought against contrary winds, so too do modern archaeologists contend with the invisible currents of time. Erosion, silence, and the slow forgetting of landscapes that once thrived with life. It is tempting to see in this parallel a kind of eternal symmetry. The sea resists the sailor, the desert resists the seeker. The voyage home is never without ordeal, nor is the quest for origins ever complete. Perhaps this is why Egged's absence compels us still, not because we expect to walk its streets, but because its disappearance mirrors our own struggle with impermanence. Cities rise, empires proclaim their eternity, and yet the sands and tides remind us that even greatness can vanish without leaving a stone to touch. And so, the return of the Carthaginian fleet and the lost silence of a god become threads in the same fabric of human striving. One story ends with weary sailors docking under familiar skies. Another lingers unresolved beneath the shifting soil of Mesopotamia. Yet both summon the same question. How much of our labor endures, and how much will be left for others to search, wonder, and dream? The winds have stilled, but the mystery continues, waiting like a horizon not yet reached.